Over the next few minutes, you're going to learn something you should have already known, but almost certainly do not. You're going to learn more about what sparked the global financial meltdown. You're going to learn that it was a criminal enterprise. You're even going to learn who might be responsible. If by the time this presentation is over, you're not angry, then that means you weren't paying attention. You should probably watch it again. To understand what happened, first we need to go back to March 11th, 2008, when something very strange occurred on Wall Street. Somebody made what seemed like a ridiculous bet that, within the next few days, the share price of Bear Stearns would drop faster and harder than ever in that company's history, or the history of nearly any other company of its size. Was Bear Stearns in trouble? Well, like most every other American investment bank, during the housing boom that was ending in those days, Bear had made some bad investments in the subprime mortgage market, and, like most every other American investment bank, its balance sheet had suffered as a result. Yet on March 11th, Bear had several $billion in cash on hand, meaning there was certainly no risk that the company would be unable to make good on its near-term promises. However, somebody was betting otherwise. In a move many have compared to buying $1.7 million worth of lottery tickets, somebody bought $1.7 million in Bear Stearns put options, giving them the right to sell 5.7 million shares of Bear Stearns on a future date for $30 apiece. But here's the catch. At the time, Bear was trading at around $65 per share, and that future date was a mere 7 trading days away. Those were some unusually long odds, so long in fact that those options weren't even considered reasonable and thus not even offered for sale. Whoever bought them had to make a special request, which at the time seemed so outlandish, the trade itself sparked news coverage and one expert in the field to say of the trade, "It's not even on the page of rational behavior unless you know something." Know something? Like what? Well, stick around for a few more minutes and I'll tell you what they knew. The day after those put options were sold, somebody sold some shares of Bear Stearns stock, but never delivered the shares to the buyers. Now that's not entirely unheard of. After all, accidents do happen, and so the system is set up to temporarily accommodate those so-called delivery failures by crediting the buyer's account with what essentially amount to IOUs intended to take the place of the undelivered shares until the temporary impediment to their delivery can be resolved. The buyer never knows they've received IOUs in place of actual shares, and that's okay because in the meantime, until they can be replaced, those IOUs are treated like the real thing in that they can be bought and sold. In other words, the occasional stock delivery failure is a normal part of the marketplace. However, what was happening to Bear Stearns on that day was not at all normal. That's because on that day, over 1 million shares went undelivered, an unusually high percent of all shares trading. The next day, the number was still up to 750,000 shares of Bear Stearns that people bought but never received. The day after that, the number of undelivered shares rose to 2 million. The next day, nearly 14 million. By the next day, there remained 13 million of these phantom shares coursing through the system. Then 12 million, then 8 million. All told, between the day those options were purchased and the day they came due, somebody caused the supply of Bear Stearns stock to artificially swell by many millions of shares. To understand why this is a problem, we need only refer back to the most basic principle of economics, that is supply and demand, and the fact that when supply goes up and demand remains unchanged, price will always go down. One look at the chart comparing each day's delivery failures with the same day's closing stock price, and we see that, as expected, the principle of supply and demand held true in the case of Bear Stearns as well. What made all this possible is a small but lethal loophole in the United States stock settlement system which, until recently, permitted a manipulative form of stock trading commonly known as naked short selling. Now, before moving ahead, I should make one distinction very clear. Short selling is a beneficial and legal practice, permitting the short seller to profit from declines in a company's share price. Any one of us could do it if we chose to. Short selling, however, is not the same as buying put options. However, both are means of profiting from declines in a stock's price. Naked short selling is a name often applied to an illegal, steroid-enhanced perversion of short selling, and is the most common mechanism by which stock manipulators generate supply-swelling IOUs to sell instead of real shares. Neither you nor I could do this, but until relatively recently, a few powerful folks on Wall Street could and actively did engage in naked short selling in order to manipulate the price of a company's stock down, making their regular short positions and put options much more lucrative. If the distinction between short selling and naked short selling is not completely clear, or if you'd just like to learn more about it, check out businessjive.com. Whoever bought those Bear Stearns put options was almost certainly also responsible for naked shorting the price of Bear Stearns stock from over $60 a share to under $5, such that a $1.7 million long shot turned into a $270 million windfall in a little over 1 week. That's a return of 8,000%. And at what cost? Well, some things we can quantify and some things we can't. Among the things we most easily can quantify, it cost billions and billions of dollars in shareholder wealth, 29 billion taxpayer dollars used to guarantee the eventual shotgun wedding between Bear Stearns and JP Morgan, and the jobs of several thousand Bear Stearns employees. But that's barely the beginning, because the criminals, which is what stock manipulators are, managed to get away with it, and the cost of that may never fully be realized because, as everybody knows, when a criminal gets away with their crime, it's certain to happen again. And indeed, it did. But not before the United States Senate Banking Committee met in early April of 2008 to figure out exactly what happened to Bear Stearns. The hearing was held days after Bear collapsed, lasted 4.5 hours, but could have been boiled down to a pair of questions, both posed to Christopher Cox, who was chairman of the SEC at the time. The first came from Senator John Tester from Montana.
Chairman Cox, has anyone brought to your attention, or do you know of the possibility of short selling that helped bring down Bear Stearns?
I want to be careful in the way that I respond to your question. It is a perfectly appropriate question. It deserves a straight up and factual answer. I'm a little bit constrained because the SEC is in the law enforcement business, and I tried delicately to answer that question before. The SEC very aggressively pursues insider trading, market manipulation, and the kinds of illegal naked short selling that have been very publicly alleged in this case.
Okay. Thanks. I'll interpret that answer the way I think everybody else in the room interprets it.
And the second from Banking Committee Chairman Christopher Dodd of Connecticut.
But I was struck. I went back and looked at the volume of transactions. I guess, Mr. Chairman Cox, I'd like to address this to you if I can. I was looking at the volume of transactions. This looks like historic volume. I'm looking at the amount of transactions that occur daily, weekly transaction on a daily basis. The numbers run at Bear Stearns running up to this week. 3 million, 5 million, 6 million, 8 million, 7 million, 2 million shares, roughly those numbers. You get into the week of March 10th to the 14th, and the volume jumps to 32 million, 54 million, 26 million. On Friday, March 14th, 186 million. A substantial jump in volume. I'm also intrigued about the 30-day puts, the $30 puts, over 10 days. There seems to have been a rather significant. In fact, someone ran the math on it for me, and if you made a $600 investment on Thursday in Bear Stearns, on Monday that was worth about $37,000. Not a bad deal to make. To what extent is the Fed looking at this? Not the Fed, the SEC. And I understand you answered the question earlier. You can't comment on investigations. Let me put it this way to you, I guess, Joe. I mean, I would hope that you're looking at this. And to the extent this kind of spike that occurs here would seem to be, must have triggered some sort of bells and whistles at the SEC here. This goes beyond rumors. There's no violation in law about rumors. There is about collusion. And when I look at a 10-day and 30-day puts, I wonder what's going on here. And whether I see this spike, it at least raises bells and whistles in my mind what's going on. And I guess I can ask you this. Did your agency react to this at all? Was there a reaction going on that week to these activities?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Your hopes will be, I think, met and exceeded with respect to the agency's response to these concerns.
Well, there you heard it. The good news is Cox committed the SEC's Enforcement Division to actively getting to the bottom of the illegal naked short selling that was so obviously responsible for crushing Bear Stearns' stock price. The bad news is this is the same SEC Enforcement Division that spent the better part of a decade actively ignoring plain as the nose on your face evidence of Bernard Madoff's epic scam. The same Enforcement Division that, according to a United States Senate report, wrongly fired SEC investigator Gary Aguirre when he discovered evidence of insider trading by someone Aguirre's superiors deemed too politically powerful to charge with the crime. The same SEC Enforcement Division that has failed to bring a single action against anybody for naked short selling. Based on that track record, you can probably guess what happened. Nothing. And with the expected results, the naked short sellers struck again. This time the target was Lehman Brothers. The actual attack appears to have been planned to begin at the end of June in 2008, specifically on June 27th. That's the day millions of IOUs generated by naked short selling of Lehman stock began pouring into the market, shearing 40% off the company's stock price in just 2 weeks. By now, even the SEC was beginning to get the message. Manipulative naked shorting was a tool used by criminal short sellers to destroy public companies. And, barring something extreme, Lehman, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and others would undoubtedly be next. Perhaps sensing the economic Armageddon on the horizon, on July 15, the SEC announced its intention to temporarily enforce rules meant to curb the already illegal practice of naked short selling, but only in the shares of 19 banks. As the SEC's press release said, today's commission action aims to stop unlawful manipulation through naked short selling that threatens the stability of financial institutions. Immediately, the share prices of Lehman and the other 18 protected companies began to recover as naked short selling of their stock all but ended. But any sense of relief was short-lived as it became obvious to anybody paying attention that the SEC barely even understood what naked short selling is. At least such was the message transmitted loudly by Chairman Cox in this interview on Fox Business Network.
There, I guess you could say, is a growing rumbling that the SEC has not been doing its job in terms of enforcing naked short sellers and the rumor mill. How do you respond to those comments?
Well, it's a very nice opportunity to explain the mistake that your previous guest made and that a lot of the media are making right now in assuming that naked short selling is illegal. Everybody knows they don't like naked short selling. They assume, therefore, it must be illegal and against the rules in all circumstances, but that's not the case. And as a matter of fact, in the financial sector, in these largely capitalized and big float firms where you can locate shares rather easily, the opportunity to extend a fail well beyond 3 days, well beyond weeks, indefinitely currently exists. We want to make sure that that tool for manipulators, and that's what it is taken away. We are not at all interested in tamping down on legitimate short selling, but what we are after is this sort of witch's brew of the manufacture of false information and then driving the price of the stock down, not through normal laws of supply and demand, but through the manufacture of shares that don't exist, and that's what naked short selling lets you do.
And so the emergency order expired in mid-August, and the SEC gave no sign of any willingness to follow up with another. 5 months had passed since the takedown of Bear Stearns, and the prevailing attitude on Wall Street was that the SEC's little experiment in rule of law was over. As it happened, the final assault began on September 9th, when 1 million Lehman IOUs hit the market. The next day, 6 million. The day after that, 23 million. The day after that, 32 million. The day after that, it was September 15th, 28 million. On that day, under the crush of 90 million failed trades dumped into the market in just 1 week, Lehman's stock dropped to 21 cents, and the company declared bankruptcy. Despite being reduced to a penny stock, Lehman shares continued to trade and to be eagerly sold short by those intent on squeezing every last bit of life out of this 158-year-old company. And so, on September 16th, 30 million more phantom shares hit the market. The day after that, the day the assault reached its peak, the day 1 out of every 4 shares traded was an IOU, the day shares of Lehman sold for a little over a dime, 50 million more IOUs were dumped into the market. By September 17th, under a deluge of another 42 million phantom shares, Lehman traded for a nickel. By September 18th, 2008, Lehman Brothers was gone. That very day, as if to draw special attention to its own unique worthlessness as a regulator, the SEC sprang into action, issuing another emergency order intended to strengthen investor protections against naked short selling, in addition to enacting a new rule that makes clear that those who lie about their intention or ability to deliver securities in time for settlement are violating the law when they fail to deliver. Thank you very much, Dr. Cox, but you're too late. The patient was already dead. In fact, he'd been dead for a few days. And as the Wall Street Journal reported 1 week later, the global economy died with it. I suspect economists will spend decades attempting to add up the true cost of what naked short sellers have done, as the SEC stood by and allowed it to happen. So, who was actually responsible? Again, thanks to the SEC, short sellers, even naked short sellers, get to operate in utter secrecy, free from any of the disclosure requirements facing regular investors. That's not to say that the SEC couldn't find out who's responsible. That would be easy. But 1 year after Bear Stearns and 7 months after Lehman Brothers were put in their graves, nobody, not one person, has been held accountable. So, who are the most likely suspects? That's easy. Hedge funds. There's a small handful of huge multi-billion-dollar short-selling hedge funds with the resources and capacity to naked short on the level seen here. The people behind these hedge funds are among the richest in the world. They live in houses like this in Greenwich, Connecticut, this one in the Hamptons on Long Island, or this one right on Central Park in Manhattan. In fact, this guy, and this guy literally do live in these houses. In financial circles, they're treated like rock stars, and the New York financial press fawns over them in ways that would make a real journalist blush. Take, for example, the way CNBC gushes over short-selling hedge fund manager Jim Chanos, who is also head of the Coalition of Private Investment Companies, the U.S. hedge fund industry's primary Washington, D.C. lobbying organ.
In a Squawk exclusive for 2 hours, our guest host today, legendary investor and founder of Kinnikos Associates, Jim Chanos. He's also chairman of the Coalition of Private Investment Companies, a large hedge fund body. Is Kinnikos an island? What's Kinnikos? Chanos is going to be an island. You could certainly buy one now.
The president and founder of Kinnikos Associates, and he is with us for the rest of this hour. Jim, we guest host today, hedge fund manager Jim Chanos. Jim, we've been talking about how the short-selling ban expired at midnight. Hedge fund manager, short seller Jim Chanos, he's been here talking with us throughout.
We've been saying our honor editor Charlie Gasparino is breaking bread and probably eating steak with one of the most powerful men in the hedge fund industry today. He's at the New York City's Club A Steakhouse with a Power Lunch exclusive with famed short seller Jim Chanos, the chairman of the Coalition of Private Investment Companies and president of Kinnikos Associates. It's all yours, Charlie. Take it away.
You know, we're having way too much fun here, but we're going to have even more fun.
We have one of the titans of the hedge fund industry. Jim Chanos is the famous short seller.
The Brookings institution holding a forum to figure out the role that hedge funds are playing in the economic crisis. It was a stretch, but joining us first on CNBC Hedge Fund, Jim, it says here, it doesn't, you know, we know what we call it. I call you Mr. Shorty. You don't like that, really, but we're going to call you a hedge fund. We're going to make it big this time. Hedge fund titan.
Boy, that's tough objective journalism, huh? Recently, it was reported that the hedge funds run by this guy, and this guy came under investigation by the SEC after emails surfaced in which the three of them jointly conspired to do something overtly illegal. No time to give details here. If you want to learn more, check out deepcapture.com. The blog, by the way, that first obtained and published the incriminating emails months ahead of anybody else. But anyway, here's how CNBC reported on that story. Yeah, right. And on the record, while it's great to hear that the SEC is attempting to do its job by investigating short-selling hedge funds for anything, I'll eat my hat and formally apologize for almost every bad thing I've said about the SEC if they actually do anything about it. What makes me so certain? Well, simply put, these guys are too rich. They're too powerful. They've got regulators and the financial press too charmed, too captured, might be the better word. And they get what they want far too often. In short, they're emerging as a new American oligarchy. Economist Simon Johnson sees what's happening and recently began sounding the alarm. Here's what he told Bill Moyers.
The situation we find ourselves in at this moment, this week, is very strongly reminiscent of the situations we've seen many times in other places. But they're places we don't like to think of ourselves as being similar to. They're emerging markets. It's Russia or Indonesia or a Thailand-type situation or Korea. That's not comfortable. America is different. America is special. America is rich. And yet we've somehow find ourselves in the grip of the same sort of crisis and the same sort of oligarchs. It's a small group with a lot of power, a lot of wealth. They're not necessarily always the names, the household names that spring to mind in this kind of context, but they are the people who can pull the strings, who have the influence. The signs that I see this week, the body language, the words, the op-eds, the testimony, the way they're treated by certain congressional committees, it makes me feel very, very worried. I had this feeling in my stomach that I felt in other countries, much poorer countries, countries that were heading into really difficult economic situations, when there's a small group of people who got you into a disaster and who are still powerful. The disaster may even have made them more powerful, and you know you need to come in and break that power, and you can't. You're stuck.
And that will be the ultimate insult. If the people responsible for getting us into this mess, the very ones who essentially put the flame to the house of cards Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers had built, if they actually become more powerful as a result of the devastation they've caused? Well, for his part, President Obama seems to get that the SEC is broken beyond repair, and in his February address to Congress, he asked that body to come up with something better.
So I ask this Congress to join me in doing whatever proves necessary, because we cannot consign our nation to an open-ended recession. And to ensure that a crisis of this magnitude never happens again, I ask Congress to move quickly on legislation that will finally reform our outdated regulatory system. It is time. It is time.
Well, that's great. What's not great is the role hedge funds are jockeying to play in the process, because allowing hedge funds, particularly short-selling hedge funds, to help rewrite our system of securities regulation makes as much sense as allowing an arsonist to help rewrite his city's fire code. It's madness. Well, these hedge funds may have captured the SEC, but they'll never capture Congress, and that's where you come in. Go to writerep.house.gov and send a note to your elected representative demanding that when it comes to the process of fixing our system of securities regulation, hedge funds must be relegated to the role they deserve, that of observer. And after you've sent that email, I'm hoping you'll send one more. It turns out Michael Moore is making a new movie exposing Wall Street and the biggest financial swindle in American history. He's looking for those who understand the real deal to tell him what they know. I hope somebody watching this, who knows firsthand about the dirty little secret of naked short selling, will do the right thing, ignore Wall Street's code of silence, and talk to Michael Moore. You can email him at bailout@michaelmoore.com. As for the rest of you, please forward this video to your friends and send a link to Michael Moore while you're at it. Let's let him know a little more about the real deal. Finally, to learn more about any of the topics discussed on this video, please visit deepcapture.com.